In the final months of her life, as cancer quietly took away the strength in her body, Audrey Hepburn's own son says she still had not let go of one person. And it wasn't either of her two husbands. It wasn't a leading man who once begged her to marry him. It was her father, a man who walked out her life when she was 6 years old and never fully came back. That single detail, confirmed decades later by her eldest son in a television interview, reframes almost everything people think they know about the most photographed woman of the 20th century. Because underneath the black dress, the pearls, and that famously still, watchful expression she wore in every film, there was a little girl who spent the rest of her life waiting for someone who was never going to show up. Audrey Kathleen Rustin was born on May 4th, 1929, in a quiet district of Brussels called Ixelles, into a family that looked, on paper, like the height of privilege. Her mother, Ella van Heemstra, was a Dutch baroness descended from a long line of aristocracy. Her father, Joseph Victor Anthony Rustin, was a British businessman who had once served as an honorary consul in the Dutch East Indies and who later, somewhat pretentiously, added a more aristocratic-sounding surname Hepburn to his own, believing incorrectly that he was descended from a Scottish lord. The family moved constantly between Belgium, England, and the Netherlands because of Joseph's work, and by the time Audrey was still a young girl, she was already fluent in multiple languages, the kind of upbringing that looks, from a distance, like nothing but advantage. But the marriage underneath that polished surface was already coming apart. In the mid-1930s, both of Audrey's parents became involved with the British Union of Fascists, drawn into a political movement that would later become one of the more uncomfortable footnotes of her family history. One, her own son, has said she carried quiet shame about for the rest of her life. Joseph's involvement went further than casual sympathy. He was later interned in Britain during the Second World War specifically because of his fascist allegiances, a detail that stood in stark and painful contrast to the war his daughter would go on to survive on the opposite side of the front lines, hungry and hiding from the very forces her own father had once supported. In May 1935, after the marriage finally collapsed, Joseph left the household. Audrey was 6 years old. She would later describe that departure as one of the most traumatic events of her entire life, a wound that never fully closed no matter how much time or distance came afterward. Her mother sent her, not long after, to boarding school in England, and Audrey would watch other children leave for the holidays with both parents while she waited for a father who rarely, if ever, used his right to visit. Decades later, in a rare recorded interview later featured in the documentary Audrey, More Than an Icon, she recalled her mother telling her, at the time, that her father had simply gone away on a trip, a gentle lie that left a 6-year-old waiting for a return that was never going to happen. Then the world around her began to collapse as well. As war spread across Europe in the late 1930s, her mother made the decision to relocate the family to the Netherlands, believing it would be safer than staying in England. It was not. In May 1940, German forces invaded, and the comfortable life 10-year-old Audrey had known vanished almost overnight. Food grew scarce. Fear became a constant companion. Her schooling itself was reshaped by the occupation, with lessons quietly built around wartime arithmetic, the kind of grim word problems that asked children to calculate casualty numbers rather than simple sums. According to accounts from those who lived through the occupation with her, she quietly participated in efforts to support the Dutch resistance, helping deliver messages in an underground newspaper and taking part in secretive, invitation-only dance performances known as Black Evenings, held behind blacked-out windows to raise money for resistance efforts without drawing German attention. Historians who have spent years trying to verify the full scope of her wartime activities have noted that some of the more dramatic details are difficult to confirm with certainty, since Audrey herself rarely gave interviews about that period and tended to speak about it only in fragments. And one prominent Dutch museum has said it could find no archival record confirming she formerly worked for an organized resistance cell. What is well documented and not seriously disputed by historians is that her family suffered real losses during the occupation, including relatives connected to resistance activity who were arrested and executed, and that by the brutal winter of 1944, known in the Netherlands as the Hunger Winter, food had become so scarce that her family survived on tulip bulbs and bread made from ground grass. Audrey herself became malnourished and anemic, a period of starvation that would leave a permanent mark on her famously slender frame for the rest of her life. When liberation finally arrived and Allied aid workers handed out food and supplies, she later recalled receiving a simple bar chocolate and said she never forgot what that small act of kindness felt like after years of hunger and fear. When the war ended, Audrey had almost nothing except a dream of becoming a professional ballerina. She threw herself into training in London, working with an intensity that impressed everyone around her, but the years of wartime malnutrition had done lasting damage to her body, and her instructors eventually told her, as gently as they could, that she would never have the physical strength to reach the top ranks of ballet. For a girl who had clung to dance as her one surviving hope through years of occupation and hunger, that verdict was devastating. She pivoted toward acting instead, taking small stage roles in minor film parts that mostly went unnoticed. A young woman with striking features and an unusual stillness that the camera seemed to respond to even when the material she was given was forgettable. Her breakthrough came when the French novelist Colette spotted her, reportedly during a hotel visit in the south of France, and insisted she be cast in the Broadway adaptation of her novel Gigi, despite Audrey having almost no formal acting training and no experience carrying a lead role. That stage role opened the door to Hollywood, and in 1953 she starred opposite Gregory Peck in Roman Holiday, a performance so compelling that Peck reportedly insisted the completely unknown actress receive equal billing alongside him, sensing correctly that audiences were about to fall in love with her. She won the Academy Award for Best Actress for that role, and the girl who had hidden from bombing raids and Dutch cellars less than a decade earlier suddenly found herself holding the film industry's highest honor, a transformation so fast and so complete that even the people closest to her later admitted they struggled to reconcile the wartime child they remembered with the poised international star she had become almost overnight. Success brought its own complications, including a heartbreak that would shape the rest of her romantic life. On the set of Sabrina in 1954, she fell into a secret, deeply felt romance with her married co-star William Holden, a connection that both of them later described as one of the most intense of their lives, conducted quietly out of fear that public knowledge of an affair with a married man would brand her a homewrecker and derail the career she had only just begun. Their connection was intense enough that there was even talk between them of a future together, but Holden eventually revealed a devastating truth. He had already undergone a vasectomy and could not have more children. For a woman who wanted nothing more than to become a mother, that revelation ended things almost instantly. Holden, by most accounts, never fully got over her, reportedly telling friends years later that he had genuinely fallen in love with her, and the two remained connected across the following decades even as their lives moved in separate directions, eventually reuniting professionally on the 1964 film Paris when it sizzles. Not long after that heartbreak, Audrey married the actor and director Mel Ferrer in September 1954 in a quiet ceremony in Switzerland. The two had met through Gregory Peck a couple of years earlier and had been cast together on Broadway in a stage production before their offstage connection deepened into something more serious. In the beginning, Ferrer took an active role in shaping her career, offering guidance on roles and public image that Audrey, still adjusting to sudden fame, largely welcomed. Over time, though, people close to the couple noticed that guidance had curdled into something closer to control, with Ferrer increasingly making decisions that many felt should have been hers alone, from which script she accepted to how she was presented to press. Layered on top of that strain came devastating personal losses. A miscarriage in 1955, and then in 1959, a serious fall from a horse while filming The Unforgiven that broke her back and led to another lost pregnancy. Audrey later said that those miscarriages caused her more pain than almost anything else in her life, including her parents' divorce, a comparison that reveals just how deeply she had wanted a family life that kept slipping away from her. In 1960, she finally gave birth to a son, Sean, and stepped away from acting for roughly a year to focus entirely on motherhood. But the marriage kept eroding underneath the surface, with rumors of Ferrer's jealousy and controlling behavior growing louder among those who knew the couple well. And after 14 years together, she and Ferrer divorced in 1968. Her second marriage seemed, at first, like an entirely different kind of story. She met Andrea Ditti, an Italian psychiatrist, during a Mediterranean cruise in the late 1960s, and a romance moved quickly. They married in 1969, and Audrey largely withdrew from Hollywood to build a quieter life in Rome. In 1970, she gave birth to her second son, Luca, But Diddy's public image as a devoted husband didn't match his private behavior, and reports of his affairs with other women became a recurring feature of the Italian press throughout the 1970s. Audrey, who had left Hollywood partly to escape public scrutiny, found herself living through a different, more painful version of exposure. The marriage limped on for years, in large part because of her commitment to Luca and her reluctance to abandon something she had promised to make work, before finally ending in divorce in 1982, after 2 marriages that had each, in very different ways, wore her down. Audrey did something almost nobody expected a star at her level. She didn't chase a comeback or use the tabloids to rebuild her image. She retreated to a farmhouse in the small Swiss village of Tolkienaz, a home she and Ferrer had originally purchased years earlier, and she stayed there, largely out of the public eye, gardening, cooking simple meals, and walking her dogs to the village where neighbors have said she was treated as exactly that, a neighbor, someone who said good morning at the market and needed nothing more from anyone. It was in that quieter chapter of her life that she met Robert Wolders, a Dutch actor who had recently lost his wife, the actress Merle Oberon. They met at a social gathering in the late 1970s, and what grew between them over the following months and years was, by every account from people who knew them, something calmer and steadier than anything either of them had experienced before. There was no formal marriage, but Wolders was by her side constantly for the rest of her life, described by friends as a genuinely stabilizing presence rather than someone trying to manage or shape her the way earlier relationships had. It was during this period of relative peace that Audrey found the cause that would define her final years. In 1988, she attended a UNICEF benefit concert, simply as a guest, without any planned public role, and ended up speaking to the audience about what she remembered from her own childhood during wartime occupation: the hunger, the fear, the uncertainty of not knowing whether tomorrow was guaranteed. She spoke from memory because she had lived every word of it. A senior UNICEF official in the audience that night was moved enough to offer her a formal role as a Goodwill ambassador, and she accepted. Between 1988 and 1992, she traveled to some of the most difficult places in the world on UNICEF's behalf, including Ethiopia, Sudan, Bangladesh, El Salvador, and Somalia, sitting with mothers and children in refugee camps and field hospitals, using the same platform that had once made her a fashion icon to draw global attention to children in crisis. Those who traveled alongside her consistently described the same thing. She never treated the work as a photo opportunity or an obligation attached to her fame. She asked detailed questions, sat for long stretches with families who had nothing, and pushed for coverage that focused on the children rather than on her own presence. It was, by every account, the most personally meaningful work of her life, carried out by a woman in her late 50s who could easily have spent those years resting on decades of celebrity instead. Wolders traveled with her on many of these missions, staying close but never inserting himself into the work, simply present in the way he had always been. In December 1992, in recognition of that work, she received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in the United States. Barely a month later, everything changed. After returning from a difficult trip connected to her UNICEF work, Audrey began experiencing abdominal pain that specialists initially struggled to diagnose. Eventually, the cause was identified as appendiceal cancer, a rare and aggressive form of the disease that had already spread significantly by the time it was caught. Because she was too weak to fly commercially, her close friend, the designer Hubert de Givenchy, arranged for a private jet to bring her home to Switzerland for her final months. She spent that last Christmas at her home in Tolkienaz, surrounded by the people who mattered most to her, Wolders, her 2 sons, and Givenchy among them, and in a small, quiet gesture that friends later said captured exactly who she was, she gave each of the men closest to her a warm winter coat rather than anything extravagant, something practical meant to look after them once she was gone. On the evening of January 20th, 1993, Audrey Hepburn died peacefully in her sleep at home. She was 63 years old. Her funeral, held 4 days later in the small village church in Tolkienaz, drew an extraordinary gathering for such a quiet setting. Both of her former husbands, her sons, Robert Wolders, Hubert de Givenchy, and UNICEF colleagues among them. Gregory Peck, the actor who had insisted on sharing top billing with an unknown Audrey 4 decades earlier, stood and read her favorite poem aloud through tears, Rabindranath Tagore's Unending Love. It was a fittingly literary send-off for a woman whose own life had, in many ways, been defined by exactly that theme, a love that never fully resolved, a longing that outlasted every attempt to move past it. Because for all the roles she played, all the fashion history she made, and all the humanitarian work that defined her final years, the thread that ran underneath almost every major decision of her adult life traces back to that afternoon in 1935, when a 6-year-old girl watched her father walk out the door. It's there in her attraction to older, authoritative men who initially felt like stability before curdling into control. It's there in her willingness to stay in relationships long after they had stopped serving her, a pattern biographers have connected directly to a childhood spent hoping someone who had already left would eventually come back. It's there most powerfully in the decade she spent trying to reconnect with her father after the war. She eventually tracked him down through the Red Cross and discovered he had been living quietly in Dublin. In August 1964, by then an internationally famous 35-year-old movie star, she flew to Ireland to see him. What she found was not the reunion she had spent nearly 3 decades imagining. Joseph, according to accounts from those close to the family, remained distant and emotionally guarded, offering little of the warmth she had hoped for. And yet Audrey forgave him anyway. More than that, she quietly supported him financially for the rest of his life, a fact that says more about who she really was than any award she ever received. Her son, Sean Hepburn Ferrer, put it plainly in a 2020 interview, saying that his mother never got over the loss of her father and never let it go, even decades later, even after everything else in her life had seemingly settled into peace with Robert Wolders by her side. It wasn't William Holden, the co-star who never stopped loving her. It wasn't Mel Ferrer or Andrea Diddy, the 2 men she married and eventually left behind. According to her own family, the person Audrey Hepburn never fully got over was the one who left first, the man whose absence she spent a lifetime trying, in one way or another, to make sense of. There's a particular kind of grief in that, the grief of loving someone who was never fully present to receive it, and carrying that unfinished feeling quietly for nearly 60 years while the rest of the world saw only grace, composure, and a smile that never seemed to crack. Her granddaughter Emma Ferrer, reflecting years later on what she'd learned about her grandmother's inner life, said the best-kept secret about Audrey was simply that she was sad, and that for a woman so widely loved by the entire world, the lack of love she personally carried inside was almost impossible to reconcile. Audrey Hepburn built an entire life around the opposite of what she experienced as a child, choosing to become someone who showed up fully for other people, whether that meant her sons, the strangers she met in refugee camps during the final years of her life, or the quiet, steady partner who never asked her to be anything other than herself. She once said, in one of her most widely remembered public reflections, that the greatest gift anyone could get a child was the simple, unmistakable feeling of being loved. Given everything she had lived through, it reads less like a piece of advice and more like a confession, an honest account of the one thing she had wanted most and received the least, and the thing she spent the rest of her life quietly trying to give to everyone she could reach. It's worth sitting with just how long that particular kind of loyalty lasted. Most people, faced with a parent who abandoned them as a child and then offered almost nothing in return decades later, would have every reason to walk away for good after a disappointing reunion. Audrey didn't. She kept sending money. She kept some form of contact alive with a man who, by every account, never fully explained himself or apologized for the years of silence. That is not the behavior of someone who has moved on. It is the behavior of someone still quietly hoping, even into her 50s and 60s, that the relationship might still become something it never had the chance to be the first time around. Biographers who have studied her life closely have pointed to that same pattern showing up again and again in her choice of older, commanding partners who initially felt safe, in her willingness to endure controlling or unfaithful behavior far longer than most people would tolerate, and in the sheer intensity of the grief she expressed over her miscarriages, losses that for her represented a family she was still trying to build in place of the one that had fractured when she was 6. She never stopped waiting for her father to come back. But in the process of that waiting, she made absolutely certain that no one who came into her orbit, from her own children to strangers on the other side of the world, ever had to feel that same kind of absence again. That, in the end, may be the truest legacy of Audrey Hepburn, not the films, not the fashion, not even humanitarian medals, but the quiet, deliberate decision to turn one of the deepest wounds a person can carry into a lifetime of showing up for everyone else.
Hepburn really was beneath the elegance, beneath the pearls, beneath the perfectly composed smile that the whole world fell in love with. She was a girl who had waited for someone to come back. And she spent her entire life making sure nobody around her ever had to feel that same waiting. Maybe that is the greatest thing any person can do with